Hello, and welcome to Feeling Therapeutic, a show about complicated feelings. Each week, I bring in a therapist to discuss a complex feeling of their choice, one that clients typically struggle to apply to their own lives. My name is Dr. Jonathan Rahm, and with me this week is Stacey Roles, RN, PhD. Stacey Roles is the founder of Roles and Associates, a psychotherapy clinic with locations all over the province. Some highlights of the areas of her teaching expertise include her work as an Academy of Cognitive Therapy certified trainer consultant and certified cognitive therapist, lecturing as an adjunct professor at Laurentian University with the School of Nursing, and training medical students at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine. Of course, she also provides therapy herself and has advanced training in CBT, prolonged exposure therapy, brain spotting therapy, psychodynamic psychotherapies, solution focused therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, and compassion focused therapy. She also just happens to be my supervisor, and I can attest personally she's the best there is, a gently guiding therapist to give the highest quality of care that they are capable of. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Stacey. I appreciate it.
Thank you, and thank you for that kind introduction.
You're very welcome. I meant every word. I'm excited to have you on the show. I get to show off to all our listeners how I've been learning in this practicum of mine through how you share these complicated ideas. And I won't belabor the point. But what are we talking about today? What is the emotion or feeling we're focusing on?
I decided to talk about anxiety today. It's an emotion that everybody feels at some point, sometimes more consistently, maybe than other emotions. And it's an area that I focus a lot of my work in. So I thought that that would be a good one for us to discuss.
I couldn't agree more. Honestly, at this point, when a client says they don't have anxiety, I'm surprised because it seems to be so pervasive and so relevant in modern day life. Do you think that is a function of how things are in the world right now? Has it always been around? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so it's definitely always been around. We have anxiety as a survival mechanism.
Hmm.
So if we consider our very tricky brains and evolutionary psychology, we have kind of three main sections of the brain. We have this part back here that's called it's our brain stem, and they call it the reptilian brain. So reptiles have it, mammals have it, basically anything that's alive has this function. And then in the middle, we have this mammalian brain where we care about groups and families and stuff like that. And then we have this prefrontal cortex right here, which is human part of the brain.
Hmm.
In this brain stem, this reptilian part of the brain, we have something called an amygdala. And this amygdala is our anxiety threat response system. So when it goes off, when that threat gets detected, it sends signals to the rest of our body, speed up adrenaline, breathe faster, get more oxygen in, make your heart pump quicker so that we can fight something off if we have to. We can run away, we freeze, whatever we do to keep ourselves alive. If we didn't have this, if we'd never experienced anxiety, we wouldn't look both ways before crossing the street. We wouldn't stay away from danger. Most of us would never make it to adulthood. Okay. So we need this function to survive. So if somebody says, I never have anxiety, there's been definitely times in their lives when they've had anxiety. But
Okay.
usually we get the opposite. We get, I just want to get rid of my anxiety. And so we question that and reframe that, right? Like, do we really want to get rid of our anxiety? What would happen if we had no anxiety? Mhm. So
Yeah.
usually the goal is to try to better manage our anxiety.
Mm.
And that's usually what people are actually seeking out when they come to therapy for any type of anxiety that comes up.
So language actually really points to how long these concepts have been around. You know, we have the evolutionary aspect that we can point to that shows us that we've evolved these defense mechanisms through being anxious and having a kind of forewarning effect in our brains. But if you look at the way we actually describe anxiety using our words, so the Cambridge Dictionary definition is a very strong feeling of dislike or disapproval. But I would go to say that that's almost a watered down version of the etymology, which comes from, and I apologize to everyone who does speak Latin. This happens every time, but anxietatum, which comes from the noun of anxious or uneasy, troubled in mind. And that an, the an at the beginning of it, is comes from a Proto-Indo-European root, which means tight or painfully constricted. And so you can kind of interpret this as a painful constriction on your brain.
Right.
And that is such in a colorful way, but also it feels like a very accurate way of describing anxiety to me. And I was wondering, what do you think of that? What do you think of that interpretation?
Yeah, it is. It's an interesting way to describe it. I also find that when it comes to anxiety and how we look at anxiety, any emotion really, we tend to take definitions, but it's also important to take it as a concept.
Yeah.
So the difference between, the concept and a definition is like if I look up a definition of trust, for example,
Mhm.
I might, you know, say, okay, trust is, I don't, you have to actually look it up because I don't know it off the top of my head, but, being able to rely on somebody for whatever.
Sure.
The concept of trust can completely change the dynamic of that definition. So I might trust you to do certain things within the practicum experience.
Yeah.
I might trust somebody else with my money. I might trust somebody else with my secrets. I mean, there's different ways that the definition lands within the concept of whatever that relationship
Mhm.
is, right? Or that situation. So when it comes to this one, it's a very accurate, I think, way to describe an interesting way to describe anxiety. But much like our fire alarms in our house, have you ever had your fire alarm go off when there was no fire? Like we all have,
Tragically.
right?
Yes.
I do often. Um, so there's smoke, there's no actual fire. The
Mm.
amygdala works in the same way. It can't tell the difference. It's such a primitive part of our brain. It can't tell the difference between a real threat and a perceived threat. So in this definition that you've brought forward, it's would almost land more accurately with a defined threat
Mhm.
versus the perceived threat, but the experience is still the same,
Right.
which is interesting, right? Because the experience is the same whether there's a bear in front of us or we're thinking about public speaking and there's no danger.
Yep.
The reaction in our body is the same. And that's what people describe as the sensations of anxiety or maybe
Mhm.
panic attack if it gets to that.
So and I think you've kind of illustrated why it's so important to have that introductory conversation with someone who's presenting with anxiety, because their specific flavor of this concept, which is very multifaceted, regardless of if it comes up in a way that we recognize and is very human, their prefrontal interpretation of what's going on is very might be very specific to them, and they might have you might have to approach it from that angle to talk about it in that way where they understand it, meeting them at their level.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, People tend to think that when they have these symptoms of anxiety, when there's no real threat in front of them, that there's something wrong with them,
Mhm.
right? There's something wrong. Something's going terribly wrong. Maybe I'm having a heart attack, maybe. And, of course, you'd want to medically get all those things checked out. But it's this idea that something's very wrong and typically triggers more anxiety, right? So it increases the symptoms, knowing that when your body um, experiences these sensations, it's actually a sign that your brain and body are working really well together
Yeah.
because your amygdala is going off and it's sending those signals in your body. If your amygdala was going off and your body wasn't getting those sensations, then there might be more issue, right?
Mhm.
So it's and not to say to hyper focus on that idea, but it's the concept that if you experience anxiety when your amygdala's going off, it means that your brain and body are functioning well together. Now, with our fancy prefrontal cortexes that we have as humans, we can actually think about it. See if it's a real threat. Am I safe? Am I okay? Is anything happening? And that's where therapy comes into play. And we can actually pull those pieces apart with different types of therapeutic approaches.
So I would imagine that someone who's coming to you for the first time and learning all these things might be a little bit disappointed to know that they are going to feel anxiety and are instead have to broker this peace with their amygdala. Does that process become more exciting as time goes on for the people who've maybe never been in therapy before?
Yes, I think the first sessions and understanding how our brains and bodies really work, because most of us, unless we've gone through therapy or some, psychotherapy, psychology, or something, some form of training in that way, don't understand that. Usually people experience a little bit of relief
Mm,
that, okay, this is normal, and there's interventions that can happen. Again, sometimes those interventions might be therapy, but they may also be medications as interventions. Sometimes it's a marriage of both.
mhm.
But there are definitely things that can be done that are very successful, and the evidence has shown that in different types of psychotherapeutic approaches. In cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, we use a lot of something called exposure therapy. And the concept behind that is the more anxious we get, the more we tend to avoid something, right?
Sure.
The more we avoid something, the more symptoms of anxiety we tend to get around it.
Yeah.
So basically, exposure therapy is the opposite of avoiding. It's exposing ourselves to the thing that we don't want to expose ourselves to. But it's in a gradual exposure way. It's not like a fear factor approach, that show where it is, you're scared of snakes. Let's throw you in a pit of snakes. We don't do that. It's a gradual approach. So we pick things that are feasible for the person to do that evoke some anxiety, but not so much that it would give them, say, a panic attack or something. And once they do that over a period of time, then we tend to move to the next thing.
Mhm.
And that's negotiated between the therapist and the client. So that's a typical approach in behavioral therapy, for example, or cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yeah, and I think it's funny that you mentioned fear factor because I do remember growing up and watching the second challenge was always the thing that I would be the most freaked out at is like eating something gross. And by the time if you watch 10 of those episodes in a row, you're like, come on, eat the slugs. Like it's fine. Seen seven other people do it at this point. But
That's
it's
right.
funny that prolonged exposure to something that really makes you anxious, even if it's sort of an imagined or like distanced by it being on a TV show, it does actually have an effect where you normalize seeing that thing over and over again. And it's really astounding to see in clients as well as in ourselves, I think.
And absolutely. And this is typical with most parents or caregivers would do with children, right? Like
Mm,
the example is, say a child gets knocked over by a big wave,
yeah.
in the ocean, and now they're terrified of the ocean. Well, most of the time, parents will be like, okay, let's go just put our toes in. Let's
Mhm.
see if we can do that. Okay, let's go in up to our knees, right? It's this gradual exposure to the feared thing. Um, and it's, I'm describing it in a simplistic way. Usually there's a bunch of other things happening at the same time.
Sure.
So it is good to do this kind of thing with a therapist and not necessarily on your own. But that's the premise for it. And the reason, why I thought it was important to bring here today is so that people are less fearful about the approach. Because therapy, if people haven't been exposed to it before or been around it, there might be some stigmas around it, but it's really a helpful way of uncovering how you exist, think, feel, behave in the world, and how we can get you closer to your goals. So even for those without like a diagnosis of, a phobia or a diagnosable anxiety disorder, it can be really helpful just to uncover some of these different ways that we think and exist.
I wonder if there are people who see this episode who do have anxiety, but don't think about it in that way. They don't think, "Oh, I'm anxious." They just find themselves with the consequences of kind of prolonged unaddressed anxiety, what manifestations do you see of anxiety in your practice?
So there's oftentimes, unhappiness within the person needing to spend a lot of time prepping themselves for certain things. Anxiety will often pop up in three different realms: the before event, during event, or after event, right? So I can give you an example of, say, somebody with social anxiousness.
Right.
And they might, before the event, worry about the getting ready, have a lot of sensations in their body, maybe going to the bathroom a lot, that kind of stuff. Other people, they might be fine before, but when they're at the event, they might feel like they're going to have a panic attack. And then others might be fine before and during, but afterwards, they call it the postmortem, where they're picking apart everything that they did or said wrong, or did I embarrass myself, or did I. So, and some people might be in all of them, but typically there's one area that stands out a little bit more for each person. So that's one way we can start to, look at where is it coming from. Um, how is it presenting? There are so many different forms of anxiety presentations. That was kind of like a social anxiously person
Sure.
example. But then there's like PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder, is a form of anxiety disorder. Which usually it used to be called shell shock, after people would come back from war, right? Experiencing something traumatic. But we know now that anyone can experience PTSD if they've experienced something traumatic, either real or even if they didn't witness it. There's different definitions in the DSM-5, but I won't get into that. So there's all these different presentations that can come up. Some people have panic disorders, some people have or present with panic attacks. So it depends how the person's showing up and what they want to work on. So typically the questions we want to know is what what in your life, if you could change it through therapy, what would it look like? What would look different? What would stay the same? And
Mhm.
that's like a magic wand question, right? If I had a magic wand, what would look different? What would stay the same? And so if somebody says, I'd be going out for dinner with my friends like I used to. Okay, so what's getting in the way of that? And then you can kind of uncover if there's a social anxiety thing, or maybe it's had to do with a new disability that the person's experienced, or maybe it's, got to do with a job loss, and there's like other emotions, which I'm sure you're going to talk about in your episodes, like shame or different things coming up.
Mhm.
So, there's a big enmeshment of emotions that usually occurs. And so somebody watching, if they're like, I'd really like this to be different. I'd like not to feel this way as much as I do, maybe. That might be the simplest answer to that question. That was a long answer.
I do just wanna add on to that. I find that, asking about sleep can lead you very organically to talking about anxiety because people who have this sort of chronic insomnia might experience either an anxiety directly related to sleep or they'll have an anxiety that pops up right before they're going to go to bed and now they're thinking about it and now they're doing everything but sleeping. And it's funny because there's so many roads to this topic. I find that, which is why I said I'm so surprised where if it never comes up in an entire set of therapy sessions that this person is anxious. It surprises me because so many conversations end up with it. Yeah, I feel tense about this, and I don't stop thinking about it, and I can't function when I start thinking about this. I'm like, interesting. Tell me more.
That's exactly. So that curiosity, right? Being curious about our emotions, where it comes up. Um, when did it start? When was
Mm,
the first time you remember feeling this way,
mm.
when it comes to anxiety? Maybe it was as a child. Maybe it was, after an incident occurred, maybe after a car accident, maybe, so we can be really curious about it, and then we can dive in and I always say unearth, what's below the surface, right?
So in closing, it sounds like there's this natural phenomenon that humans have where we will have a protective anxious response. It's just that when that anxious response is brought up in an inappropriate situation and you're dealing with it a lot and it's functionally curbing your ability to live your life, it does behoove you to try out therapy, or at the very least, like start considering what this feeling is besides, oh, that's just how I am.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Exactly. And start to notice if there's ways that you're coping with it that might not be ways that you'd like to cope with it. So we can talk about people with anxiety disorders sometimes engage in skin picking or hair pulling, right?
Yes.
Many of us will bite our nails. Do we do it to the point where it's a problem or that we're bleeding, right? So we all cope in different ways. We're
Hmm.
human. Are the ways which we're using to cope being extremely unhelpful to us or unhelpful in certain ways that we might want to change, right? And find new coping mechanisms. So that's another question we can ask ourselves when it comes to anxiety or really any emotion.
Well, if you're interested in having those kind of conversations with the therapist, this feels like the right time to inform you that the show is brought to you by Roles and Associates. We provide in-person and virtual therapy in various locations across Ontario. Our team specializes in treating mental health disorders, addictions, and relationship issues among age groups across the lifespan, including individuals, couples, families, and children. If you or someone you care about would benefit from psychotherapy, please visit rollspsychotherapy.com. And Stacey, it is your clinic, so you have now the stage to plug anything you want. You're covered. You don't have to talk about the clinic. You can bring up anything. What would you like to plug here at the end?
I always like to leave people with something that they can walk away with, that they can try themselves. So let's do a strategy for how we can calm down that amygdala. That amygdala is, like I said, it's primitive. What it can't do at the same time is comprehend breathing slow and deep and feeling distress and firing up. Okay, it's kind of like when you wave your dish towel in front of your smoke alarm when it's going on, right? It just stops or
Sure.
calms it down. It might pick back up, but then you can calm it down again. So deep breathing does that for the amygdala. So there's different ways to do deep breathing. Some people have difficulty just focusing on taking deep belly breaths when they're
Hmm.
experiencing anxiety because they're feeling like they can't get enough oxygen in when
Sure.
actually they're being over oxygenated at the time. So people can hold their breath for a moment just to try and calm it down, or they can breathe out. Just that, like when you're kids, you breathe out as hard as you can before you had to suck back in. And that's a natural way of slowing it. There's different apps that do like box breathing, like breathe in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 4, hold for 4. But one that I really like, and I'm going to show you guys today, that if you have a private spot, you can go to even a bathroom stall or something, you can do this one, and it's because it takes both sides of the brain. It's almost like when if you were young and you ever tried like patting your head and rubbing your belly at the same time, you really have to focus. This
Sure.
one engages both sides. So I'm going to get you to do it with me. Okay, John?
I
Okay. So you can put your middle finger on your forehead just to steady your hand. And then you can are you right handed? Yeah.
Yeah.
Plug your right nostril with your thumb. Just block it off. Yep. Yep. And then I want you to inhale through your left nostril. So once you get to the top of the inhalation, put your pinky on your left nostril and release your thumb. And then exhale through the right side. And then inhale back through that right side. Block, release, exhale. Do it again. And just keep going with this for a few minutes. And try and go slow. Focus on switching sides. Maybe close your eyes if that helps. And because it's taking an action and some brain power to do, and it's also slowing your breath, it tends to work really well. And that's been like a favorite of the clients that I've seen, to be able to go and do that. And it really directs their focus away from the perceived threat.
Very relaxing. Very zen. And
And then that way we can, you know, welcome our anxiety when it's keeping us safe, right? We don't want to start doing that deep breathing if there's a threat that we need to run away from, right? That's why our body does that. But when it's a perceived threat and we know it's our, prefrontal cortex doing this, this is a way to help calm that amygdala down.
well, then this is going to be the truest time I've said this so far. That is another episode done. And honestly, that feels pretty good. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.